The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was a grassroots effort of ordinary citizens determined to end racial injustice in the United States. Although no central organization directed the movement, several major groups formed to share information and coordinate civil rights activities. Each of these groups had its own priorities, strategies, and a way of operating, but they all hoped to focus the energies of thousands of Americans committed to securing civil rights for all Americans. Behind the case of Brown versus Board of Education was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. It is one of the oldest civil rights organizations in the United States. The group formed in 1909 as an interracial organization, allowing both African American and white Americans as members. W.E.B. Du Bois, a prominent African American scholar, was a founding member. Du Bois had been the first African American to receive a doctoral degree from Harvard University. He served as the NAACP's Director of Publicity and Research and also edited the NAACP magazine, The Crisis. From the start, the NAACP focused on challenging the laws that prevented African Americans from exercising their full rights as citizens. The NAACP worked to secure full legal equality for all African Americans and to remove barriers that kept them from voting. In the 1920s and 1930s, lynching was still a threat to African Americans, particularly in the South. Working to end such violence, the NAACP succeeded in getting two anti-lynching laws passed by the House of Representatives in the 1930s. Southern leaders in the Senate prevented the bills from becoming law, but the NAACP continued to keep the issue of lynching in the public eye. The NAACP was more successful in lawsuits that challenged segregation laws. In the 1920s and 1930s, it won a number of legal battles in the areas of housing and education. The NAACP appealed mainly to educated middle and upper class African Americans and some liberal white Americans. Critics charged that it was out of touch with the basic issues of economic survival faced by many poor African Americans. One organization that took on economic issues was the National Urban League, founded in 1911. The League sought to assist people moving to major American cities. It helped African Americans moving out of the South to find homes and jobs and ensured that they received fair treatment at work. League workers also looked for migrant families on ship docks and at train stations and found safe, clean apartments for them. They also insisted that factory owners and union leaders allow African American workers the opportunity to learn skills that could lead to better jobs. Founded by pacifists in 1942, the Congress of Racial Equality was dedicated to bringing about change through peaceful confrontation. It too was interracial, with both African American and white members. During World War II, CORE organized demonstrations against segregation in cities including Baltimore, Chicago, Denver, and Detroit. In the years after World War II, CORE director James Farmer worked without pay in order to keep the organization alive. The growing interest in civil rights in the 1950s gave him a new base of support and allowed him to turn CORE into a national organization, one that would play a major role in the confrontations that lie. In 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. and other African American clergymen began a new civil rights organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, that advocated the practice of nonviolent protest, a peaceful way of protesting against restrictive racial policies. The SCLC shifted the focus of the civil rights movement to the South. Early organizations had been dominated by Northerners. Now Southern African American church leaders moved into the forefront of the struggle for equal rights. Among them was Martin Luther King Jr., who became a national figure. When the Montgomery bus boycott began, Martin Luther King Jr. was a young Baptist preacher. Within a few years, he would become one of the most loved and admired and also one of the most hated people in the United States. King became not only a leader in the African American civil rights movement, but also a symbol of nonviolent protest for the entire world. As he became more and more involved in the civil rights movement, King was influenced by the beliefs of Mohandas K. Gandhi. Gandhi had been a leader in India's long struggle to gain independence from Great Britain, an effort that finally succeeded in 1947. Gandhi preached the philosophy of nonviolence as the only way to achieve victory against much stronger foes. Those who fight for justice must peacefully refuse to obey unjust laws, Gandhi taught. They must remain nonviolent regardless of the violent reactions such peaceful resistance might provoke, a tactic that requires a tremendous discipline and courage. The philosophy of protest advocated by King had other sources as well. American author Henry David Thoreau had been an advocate of civil disobedience in the mid-1800s. Thoreau, who opposed the 1846 war with Mexico, refused to pay his taxes and as a result was jailed. He then wrote about his experience and the principles behind his actions in his famous essay, Civil Disobedience. As the Montgomery bus boycott ended and protesters prepared to ride the newly integrated buses, King began training volunteers for what they might expect in the months ahead. Films, songs, skits showed Gandhi's activities and demonstrated the success of passive resistance in India. Bus riders were advised to follow 17 rules for maintaining a nonviolent approach in case they encountered confrontations on the buses as they traveled throughout the South. As a result of his role in the Montgomery bus boycott, King gained national prominence. He went on to play a key role in almost every major civil rights event. His work earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. A new student organization conceived by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference took a somewhat different approach. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, usually known as SNCC, began in 1960 at a meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina, for students active in the struggle. The SCLC Executive Director Ella Baker thought that the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were not keeping up with the demands of young African Americans. She wanted to give them a way to play an even greater role in the civil rights movement. Nearly 200 students showed up for the first SNCC meeting. Most came from Southern communities, but some Northerners attended as well. Baker delivered the opening address. The younger generation is challenging you and me, she told the adults present. They are asking us to forget our laziness and doubt and fear and to follow our dedication to the truth to the bitter end. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke next to the young audience, calling the civil rights movement a revolt against the apathy and complacency of adults in the Negro community. At the end of the meeting, the participants organized a temporary coordinating committee. A month later, students met with Baker and other Southern Christian Leadership Conference and core leaders and voted to maintain their independence from civil rights groups. By the end of the year, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a permanent and separate organization. It was interracial at first, though that changed years later. With fresh new ideas and strong leaders like Bob Moses, SNCC became a strong and vital organization for students wanting to take part in the civil rights movement. As the struggle intensified, SNCC became a powerful force, and many students found that they would risk almost anything for their beliefs. One SNCC leader who heard Malcolm X's message of black nationalism was Stokely Carmichael. Carmichael had been a student at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and became actively involved in the Washington chapter of SNCC. By the mid-1960s, Carmichael had risen to a position of leadership in SNCC, and the organization had become much more radical. After being beaten and jailed for his participation in demonstrations, he was tired of nonviolent protest. He called on SNCC workers to carry guns for self-defense. He wanted to make the group exclusively black, rejecting white activists. The split in the civil rights movement became obvious in June of 1966. At a protest march in Greenwood, Mississippi, while King's followers were singing "We Shall Overcome," Carmichael's supporters drowned them out with "We Shall Overrun." Then Carmichael, just out of jail, jumped onto the back of an open truck to challenge the moderate leaders. This is the 27th time I've been arrested, and I ain't going to jail no more. The only way we're going to stop the white men from whipping us is to take over. We've been saying freedom for 6 years, and we ain't got nothing. What we got to start saying it now is black power. As he repeated, we want black power, the audience excitedly echoed the new slogan. Carmichael's idea of black power resonated with many African Americans. It was a call to unite, to recognize their heritage, to build a sense of community, to begin to define their own goals, to lead their own organizations, and to support those organizations. This is the movement that becomes known as Black Power. In the fall of 1966, a new militant political party, the Black Panthers, was formed by activists Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. The Panthers wanted African Americans to lead their own communities. They demanded that the federal government rebuild the nation's ghettos to make up for years of neglect. The Panthers also wanted to combat what they saw as police brutality in the ghettos. Often, as a result of their monitoring the police, they became engaged in direct confrontation with white authorities. Newton repeated the words of Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong: "Power flows from the barrel of a gun." Although they did organize some beneficial community programs, such as breakfast programs to feed the youth in their communities, the Panthers more often found themselves in violent encounters with police. Black Power gave rise to the slogan, "Black is Beautiful," which fostered racial pride. It also led to a serious split in the civil rights movement. More radical groups like SNCC and the Black Panthers moved away from the NAACP and other more moderate organizations.